Good afternoon and good morning. This is Stefan Bartke speaking. We are here, that means Reimund Schwarze and I. We are calling you from Leipzig, and with us is Peter Meyer, dialing in from the US by phone. Peter, welcome. Glad to hear you. I have the pleasure to welcome you to our fourth DeosNet webinar today, which will be hosted by Reimund and by Peter. And as you know, it is a webinar that will deal with the question of urban climate resilient infrastructure finance. It is, as I said, the fourth webinar, and it is part of the DeosNet network. And allow me a few minutes to introduce to you DeosNet. DeosNet is a network of young and senior professionals which strives at supporting the shaping of the city of tomorrow. That means we like to support from science, but also from practice, cities that more sustainably are available and waiting to be prepared for the development of tomorrow, and are supported to us their countries to do so. DeosNet is a platform to exchange ideas and innovations, but also to give access to expert knowledge. Experts in particular from the US and Germany, but also going beyond to all stakeholders interested in exchanging about concepts for more sustainable cities and land use. As part of DeosNet, we are organizing different exchange forms, and one of that is a summer school that will take place in May in Bochum, Germany. It will focus on the topic of structural change and brownfield recycling in German cities, and is organized at the Bochum University. You see on the screen some rough dates of that event, which will bring together key experts in the field, and there are available some grants for US students to join this event. You can find more information on the DeosNet website and with the hashtag Summer School. So feel welcome to visit the site and apply for being part of it. For today, we will be discussing a topic that will focus on the question of climate resilience infrastructure financing, and this is a topic that takes up the very first webinar that DeosNet offered. It was offered by Reimund Schwarze and Peter Meyer. I have to apologize that the slide obviously jumped already into the presentation, so that is a small indication of where we are heading to today. Before going there, allow me to briefly tell you about the previous summer schools that were provided. You can see them presented here. So we started in September 2017 already with an introduction to the status quo of climate resilient infrastructure financing, and we will today continue that first presentation by looking into the updates that are available and have emerged since the Fiji and Bonn results. We had then two webinars focusing more site-specific to general concepts of optimizing the redevelopment for environmental burden sites, so urban development on a more quarter area, district area, and on, in particular, brownfield redevelopment, the case of Opel and GM in Bochum, Germany. You can download and view all three of these webinars online at the DeosNet platform, and you will be able to also view the recording of today's webinar online. So my last slide before I hand over to Reimund and Peter is to remind you that you can be a part of that webinar by chatting and using the chat box to contact us and engage with us. This way you can pose questions to Reimund and to Peter. please put your questions to the chat box or email them to us by mail at webinar@deus.net, or you can also tweet them to the stated address. Do that during the presentation, and if appropriate, then Reimund and Peter will take the question immediately, or they might answer to the bunch of questions or couple of questions that come in after the presentation. So stay tuned, and I'd like to hand it over now to the presenters, to Professor Reimund Schwarze from UFZ in Leipzig, and to Peter Meyer, Professor Emeritus from the US. Reimund, I hand over the mic to you. The place is yours.
Hello, everybody, and I hand over immediately to Peter Meyer from here. Peter, can you hear me? Take over, please, from here. So Peter seems not online or lost the line for a moment, so I will start the presentation from here on. Well, this is a presentation about urban climate resilience infrastructure, and basically we will start from the general finding, which is probably the best expression of the philosophy of our approach. It comes from Ban Ki-moon. It's basically saying that we in the war against climate change are at a point where the struggle towards a climate resilient future will be won or lost in cities. I follow, as I say, mostly the view we are facing a period where in only about 30 years we see kind of a move of humanity, as the Science Advisory Board to our German Chancellor has put it. Urban population will almost double from 3.4 billion to 6.3 billion, putting a very heavy pressure to build new infrastructure, which, if only gray or brown, but not green, will decide if we can or if we cannot achieve towards the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees goal of the Paris Agreement. In fact, only the cement needed for the move of humanity towards urban areas, without even considering the renewable or the basis of energy productions in cities, will suffice to fail towards the 1.5 degree goals. Most of this major move of population will happen in Asia and Africa, as we see. So in particular, regions like India and China are exposed to the fact. So, but basically, this is a challenge to, it's a global challenge beyond the regions of Asia and Africa. So next, oh, this is terrible. Sorry. In face of this huge challenge, we will take you into the political economy of climate infrastructure finance. And this is essentially what we have to bring to you. Firstly, we will give an overview on urban climate infrastructure finance issues, how they are framed in the existing literature and how we frame it throughout this seminar. We will give you a short glimpse on what is in the Paris Accord, mainly towards the bottom up of financing, or that means through non-state actors such as cities. We will then go to the centerpiece of our presentation, which is looking into carbon pricing, or the role of carbon pricing and carbon risk disclosure. Often they are seen as, so to speak, the panaceas of the to solve the problems ahead, key ingredients to overcome this large infrastructure finance gap. But we hope to caution you, they themselves will not deliver. We need more. Basically, we need the political will of national and local actors, and there's a high role towards co-benefit approaches, and we give examples on exactly how that could look out. I need the next slide.
My phone keeps kicking me off, Reimund. My apologies to all attendees. I have no idea why this is happening. Where are we at this point?
Where have you closed? I could continue from here. It's more stable, I guess.
Yeah, I have no idea why I'm being closed off. It's very difficult.
So I could take over from you, right?
Well, you could take over from me because at this point, this connection is completely unreliable. I have no idea why this is happening.
Okay.
It has not happened to us before.
All right. Sorry to the audience very much. We have a problem with going through the air or the ether along the Atlantic. From here, as I said, I opened already the issue. The narrative is from billions to trillions. The trillions is the need. The billions is what is available. And we see if we just go to the element of climate financing, that is the margin needed to finance green infrastructure rather than gray. We call that climate finance. It's in the billions. So from it's currently 300 billions. And roughly about 400 billion available. The gap is framed in most of the literature as resulting from a lack of capacity and creditworthiness of city in assessing private capital market. The reality is that city infrastructure finance is often principally available in terms of accessing the market, but too expensive and appears to many decision makers at the local level less immediate than other current expenditure needs, such as public salaries, subsidies for affordable housing, or general investment in traditional grey compared to what Peter termed the green infrastructure. The way forward, as pointed out by many economists, is to set a price on carbon and take account of the carbon risk in terms of disclosing the carbon risk to the planner, the investment planner. But will this alone close the gap on available climate infrastructure finance? Will it make and attract banks to support in terms of credit line this sort of investment, or is more needed in terms of political will and framework conditions? So the question is, what is necessary and what is sufficient to resolve the move from billions to trillions? Next. As I mentioned initially, there is an estimate of the needs at the global level. Thank you very much. That has been conducted by the London School of Economics. In essence, it's the group on the new climate economy, the header of better growth and better climate as the best estimate of needs of global investment towards green infrastructure, and that we are aware of in this group. They assess the additional cost for low carbon investment required to meet the Paris Agreement's goal to stay below 2 degrees Celsius average in global warming, actually projected on a 66% probability of success only. So we are not really sure that with this investment we can achieve towards the Paris Agreement, but let's say we can sufficiently rely on these measures to deliver towards Paris. This figure in front of you demonstrates the incremental cost, and you see in the base case without green investment it would be some 89 trillion needed just to as I say, serve the move of humanity to urban areas. But this would be mainly grey infrastructure. We need to have some additional investments in terms of greening this kind of infrastructure needs in the future to 2030. This is mainly to make the city buildings, industry and transport more energy efficient, which is set at about 9 trillion or
thanks for your patience. Thanks we have had some audio problems. I hope we are back now with you. And a short question to Peter. Peter, if you could rest the mouse and do not move from that is seen by all partners, I think. So I hope we are all here again. Sabine, your typing audio is gone again. Can you hear me, Sabine?
I'm back on, but I keep getting bounced off. I don't know whether you can hear me.
Peter, I can hear you very well. And Sabine, Andreas, Ahu, or Detlef, many people being out there. Could you, by the chat box, please confirm that we are still with us? Thank you. I see 4 people are writing. Wonderful, audio spec. So by that, apologies for the technical inconvenience. And now, if none of us will move the mouse any longer, we just have the slide changes from here. I give the word back to Reimund, and maybe Reimund, you restart with that slide that we just had before, so that we ensure that all partners have seen and have received the same information. So thanks to all for your patience, Reimund.
So here's Reimund back. Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, I see some of you responded. Thank you very much, and also from my side, I apologize for the inconvenience. So as I tried to explain the graph to you from the new climate economy, saying it will be just about 15% roughly that we need an additional cost to make this general infrastructure need for cities at the global scale green, so to speak. And that's essentially much less than we expected. But of course, even this just 15% will be numbers in the trillion, where we have only available billions in climate finance. So let's go on from here. And this is the interesting part of this study. It's not just that it poses some additional cost, but there's also some additional benefits of investing into green infrastructure, which partly balance out the needs. The largest cost saving, in essence, it's about $6 trillion accrue in reduced investment needed into fossil fuel-based capacity. Almost 1/3 of this $6 trillion saved results from avoiding the expected increase in the cost of financing of fossil fuel-based investment in the future. In other words, increasing carbon risk in the future, including the risk of assets stranded, compromise a significant offset of the costs of more climate resilient investment in the future. The term stranded assets refers to the change in technology, markets, or regulation which render economic assets worthless, eliminate their value, so to speak, in a moment. This, while often perceived as to be just a single element, a single one-time effect, so to speak, so the economists would call that sunk cost, there is an effect for the economy as a whole, because a sudden loss of asset values can severely impact any single economic actor's ability to finance and capital market, result in insolvency, and cities as single actors in that sense are thus put at risk towards their creditworthiness in the future if they now invest in grey infrastructure, fossil fuel based. There's some additional cost savings through smart transmission and distribution of power in a more compact and better connected, IT-driven city system of about 3 trillion in sum. So if you just look up the pink and the green and add this, you see the effect of smart cities as part of element of saving into green and smart infrastructure. So essentially this will come down to a cost of $93 trillion 93 trillion US dollar that will be needed to serve what I called the move of humanity into urban areas. But in terms of the net additional cost just being a few trillion towards what we would have to face anyway in terms of the gray infrastructure need. Again, this diminishes the need, but still it doesn't resolve the problem of trillions that compare to the billions available. So let us look at the next slide. We will discuss this throughout the seminar and also see how we can resolve this kind of billion to trillion issue. And much of the ideas that are out there, or the studies out there, are actually a sum of studies that had been done on cases of finance, instruments of finance, innovations in finance. And when we go through that, we should keep in mind, as we are in the Deus net here, that there are some substantial influences from national circumstances. So what may fit to Germany may not fit to the US, may not fit to Kenya. And I know in this group we have a large global audience from all over the world. And before we think that we find the one-size-fits-all solution by just an innovation that is useful in the US, but not in Germany or in Nairobi, in Kenya, that case, it doesn't help us much. So we need to consider the national circumstances. Just an example, often it is proposed, and it will be proposed also in this seminar, that we go for tax increment finance. So the idea that putting up green infrastructure has a positive effect on the land value of surrounding lands and serve in that sense also the tax basis of the cities, which is land tax in fact. And you must just acknowledge this may be very useful because in the US, because US cities could generate almost 80% from their own tax basis, again, mostly land taxes. Whereas in Germany, this is much smaller, just less, significantly less than 20%, between 10 and 16, can be only refinanced through land tax, communal land taxes. And in fact, they don't even respond to land value changes because we have the land tax is based on unit values, which are only adjusted very infrequently, as you see, but not on a yearly basis. So this kind of national circumstances we need to keep in mind if we run to the idea of finding solutions. Well, the first thing is,
if you want, I can take over here, Reimund.
You could take over if the connection is stable. Yes.
Well, let's try the connection and see how stable it will be.
All right.
Because what we're really what Reimund and I were looking at here is we're looking really at this question. We've seen the idea of the brown and the gray infrastructure versus the greener infrastructure. Well, let's now try and define somewhat better what climate resilient infrastructure is. Well, climate resilience is something that I think is well understood, and that's this capacity of urban systems to prepare and respond to the risks and impacts of natural hazards and so on. We're dealing here with a combination of mitigation, trying to limit the amount of greenhouse gases that get emitted as the result of city functions, but also an adaptation. And the adaptation, I think, is the climate actions that are going to deal with disaster risk reduction. And what's really, I think, critically important here is to understand that we have two kinds of resilience that we need to examine here. There's the hard infrastructure, and this talks about buildings, utilities, transportation system, and so on. But let's think about, do you really want to reinvest in repairing
breakdown.
Rail line that looks like it's going to be underwater if sea level rise occurs as planned. Any of that kind of an investment in that kind of hard infrastructure is not going to wield its total return if, in fact, at some point during the lifetime of that infrastructure, it ends up underwater and unusable. But so that's one issue. But the other issue is this issue of what we call soft infrastructure. And what we're really dealing with here is a variety of things that constitute some of the safety net. But when you look at these physical structures, parks, schools, and so on, many of these kinds of developments that cities can do may also constitute refuges in the event of floods, the schools and the libraries and the like. And parks and public pools and facilities like this are sometimes used. It was inadequate, but that was certainly what was intended in Houston when they got this massive rainfall last year. They actually had systems in place which were supposed to be holding ponds for the excess water that could accumulate. They were inadequate, but they were certainly a different kind of infrastructure that we don't necessarily think of when we think of the hard infrastructure. And certainly the emergency networks, the information networks that make it possible to respond and to limit damage become critically important. So climate resilient infrastructure really is a mix of the hard and the soft that can stand up to and be resilient to climate variability, weather variability, and climate change overall. It underpins the quality of life. It certainly can affect business continuity and business success, and obviously, therefore, can also contribute to growth and success of an urban area and its residents and citizens. Can we have the next slide, please?
Yes.
So when we're really looking at this climate resilient infrastructure, we can think about it as the fact that it really relies on this concept that has been growing and increasingly accepted, which is the concept of smart cities that take advantage of information availability and how we can use big data and how we can use information systems. And this becomes important on several levels. First of all, if we're going to do any resilience planning at all, we need to know what it is that we need to be resilient in response to. So we need to be able to forecast. We need to be able to better forecast the threats and opportunities that may confront the city. And each city needs to be capable of doing it for itself. You cannot use the forecasts from one city as the basis for projecting what the impacts are going to be on another one. They have different coastlines, they have different water systems, they have different infrastructure structures that they have inherited in terms of the existing built environment. So those threats and all opportunities need to be identified for each city. And then, of course, when we look at what are the alternatives for investing in greener infrastructure, we need to look at the lifetime costs and benefits of the alternatives that we have available. Do you simply raise the levels of certain transportation systems by raising them in place, or do you put them someplace else? Did we just jump ahead a slide? Excuse me. Can we go back to the slide we were on?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so we have this problem of pursuing looking at our alternatives. Now we're back one too many. Can we get to what is basically page 14, please? Thank you. And the other thing, of course, that a smart city can do is it can inform its citizens. The citizens and civil society in general needs to be able to be better informed. from that forecasting capacity and the results of that forecasting effort, so we can inform civil society, and this is going to help enable us to have better soft infrastructure, more institutions in place that will support the resilience of the city. So we can summarize the benefit here in terms of this quote, which comes from the International Telecommunications Union, which I guess is very much in favor of IT for obvious reasons, since that's its business. But really, this can be used to be more intelligent and efficient in the use of resources. I think that these conclusions are perfectly logical and are something that we need to pay attention to looking forward and to the advantages of a small city. Can we now go on to slide 15, please? All right, so, but the availability of funds and access to the markets that may be a big problem to cities is really only half the issue we face. I'm not sure why I'm hearing an echo back there. We've got a problem on audio. But we have both hard and soft barriers. I've talked about hard and soft infrastructure. We also have hard and soft barriers to climate infrastructure finance, something we'll refer to as CIF. There's a very limited amount of money, only 55 billion out of 391 billion in climate finance that comes through grants and low-cost project debt. So there's a great concern about the need to increase the creditworthiness of cities. One of the reports, World Bank, is that only 4% of the 500 largest cities in the world are creditworthy in international financial markets, and only 20% of them, only 100 out of the 500, are even domestically creditworthy. Ideology can block the commitment of available funds. We need this political commitment in order to examine alternatives. We need political commitment to actually engage in that forecasting that can then produce evidence of an economic return that may then make a project financeable, whether or not the city is particularly creditworthy. We need to look at the sources of fundings and their priorities, because cities will sometimes change their priorities and what it is they say they're going to pursue in order to take advantage of particular sources of funding. So they change their priorities to meet the sources of funding, which is not necessarily good for the cities, because in fact the sources of funding may have priorities that are not really serving a particular city particularly well. But one of the things that when we watch cities change what they state to be their priorities in order to apply for funding, one of the things that we can learn from this is that local political will, local political objectives and motivations are not necessarily fixed. They can be changed by super-local policies and actors, that is to say, by national, regional, and international agreements of various sorts. Which brings us to the next slide, please, and I think it's your turn, Reimund.
Yes, I like to take on. We should just run quickly through the Paris Agreement, and I had the privilege, I must say, of being there in the moment when it was so largely celebrated, as you know. As such, it is often perceived to be a major diplomatic breakthrough, mainly, of course, of the French presidency. You see Laurent Fabius in the big picture on this slide. But this slide is just to caution us, to understand that much more was needed, because the success of Paris equally sits on two less visible pillars. One is the international finance pillar. You see Mark Carney of the Bank of England and Bloomberg sitting on the left. They played also a very important role. We will deal with that in a moment. And also the international pillar of cities and city networks. For example, the here you're seeing Cynthia Rosenzweig from the Climate City Research Network of UCCRN, and at that time the mayor of London was still Boris Johnson, now the foreign minister of UK. They were exchanging on what cities could do. And this is just to remind us there are two pillars that we need really to address. That is finance, and then that is the cities. So with that being said, just briefly, I guess most of you know the basics here. The Paris Agreement must be seen and really understood as a regime shift in international climate policy with a significantly lower degree of international rulemaking compared to what we had before the Kyoto Protocol. It actually solely relies on voluntary pledges of nations, a review process that has nothing more to offer in terms of sanctions than naming and shaming. In difference to the Kyoto Protocol, which was much more centralized, until 2020, there's actually not a structure existing that could take over from the Kyoto Protocol in terms of enforcement by before we simply say bye-bye to the Kyoto Protocol, which I still, as a long-term observer to the process, admire as a really relevant intermediate step that we had and that really brought us forward, though it's often discounted. But let's say from moving over from the Kyoto Protocol, which is about to end in 2020, to the Paris Accord, which will only start in 2020, we face a very difficult interim period where we have two conflicting regimes of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Accord in not being, and that could somehow reinforce themselves in terms of mutual support, but it could also be conflicting. One of the first key elements, and that is the center of the seminar, that came to the forefront is the Bonn-Fiji Commitment to Urban Action, on which the seminar will build. Sorry, next. All right. The core elements of the Paris Agreement, just to remind you, all of us, are the long-term goals to stay significantly below 2 degrees in global warming, even to strive for 1.5 degree, if possible, technically and economically. It is implemented, as I said, through simply to voluntary national pledges, which are called NDCs, national determined contributions. As we all understand, from what we have currently in terms of NDCs, we are very likely to fail towards the goals of the Paris agreements unless these national contributions can be what is called ratcheted up. That means ambitions to be increased. In that sense, these goals from the very beginning on were meant to fail if they are not to be supported by actions beyond the level of national actors. They are can be systematically thought of as being just transformational. The goals give us a signal, but the instruments that we are currently having available at the national level are insufficient. That's why much of the instruments are set at the subnational level. In fact, the Paris agreements call that the solutions agenda. It's actions which are that goes beyond the national determined contributions and take place in private initiative or at the subnational level through cities and other actors at the subnational cities. In that sense, it's actually a quite weak political regime that we have with the Paris Agreement, and the solutions agenda much hints to subnational private initiatives. A few are named on the slide. As we have advanced quite a bit in the seminar, I try to just speed up and say, I guess you all know a lot is going on at the subnational level, but core of it and core of the seminar is what's going on at the city level. In the first major effort was that at the subnational level is the so-called Bonn-Fiji Commitment to Urban Action. This means, in essence, it's just a global joining of the forces of cities and city networks worldwide. Global Convent of Meyer and Climate of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and the urban, which is mainly a network of cities in developed countries, and the Urban Leadership Council that, for example, encloses C40, is a major network of developing countries, cities, and they both agreed to implement the Paris Accord, so to speak, whatever their national governments do or not do in terms of their own jurisdictions. I'm not going through all the details because of the advanced time, but just to make the relevance clear, if we sum up what these cities do, and that these are about 17,500 cities that now are within that global network of cities for climate and renewable energy, they represent about 700 million people. Collectively, they can reduce, and they committed to 1.3 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. That is essentially more than the US as a whole commits in a year, or it's 4 times that much than the US commits emits in a year. So this is massive, and it shows how relevant this kind of subnational activities can be. If I can hand over to Peter again to just give us an idea how much this kind of joining of forces at the city level influences what happens in the US climate policy. Please, Peter, can you give us an idea how that effective what we see on the other side of the Atlantic?
Thank you, Reimund. I will try. I think this slide summarizes a couple of responses. The We Are Still In coalition was originally created 4 days after President Trump announced his plans to withdraw from the climate agreement. It has members now. This includes universities, corporations, local governments, state governments, and this represents about a third of the population. Well, it's more than a third. It's about 40% of the population of the United States. 6.2 trillion of the U.S. economy says they're going to go ahead and implement anyway. The U.S. Climate Alliance, which was created, this is an alliance of state governors, was created shortly thereafter. That actually covers a larger proportion of the population, of the economy as a whole. And they claim to be on the states that are members of the alliance are on track already to meet the emissions that were pledged, and beyond what their emissions that were pledged, reductions that were pledged in the Paris Agreement. What's interesting about this, of course, is that the member states' economies in the U.S. continue to grow more rapidly than those of the non-alliance states. So the various claims about the fact that doing these things are going to damage local economies doesn't seem to hold up. They're right now engaged in a very interesting activity, working with Resources for the Future and the Climate Impact Laboratory to measure the social cost of carbon. The objective here is to come up with numbers that are going to be able to say, this is the damage that is done by the pollution, and this then can be used to show what the economic returns are to avoiding those climate impacts, to, the economic returns to mitigation, which should ideally help attract more capital to these kinds of projects. Can we go on to the next slide, please, to number 23? I think it's 20, no, it's 22, my apologies. But one of the other things that we should mention along the way here is that there is a group also in the United States now called Climate Mayors, which accounts for something on the order of 350 of the largest cities in the U.S., that is now challenging the efforts of the Trump administration to eliminate the Clean Power Plan that was put in place by the Obama administration, which I think is going to push that whole agenda forward somewhat more. But what we have here on this chart, very quickly, is we see in the United States an objective of trying to reduce its overall emissions by 26 to 28%. When you look on the left-hand side, through 2015, we had already seen the U.S. reduce its level of activity, emissions rather, by 11.5%. There were, as of the forecast right now, is that by 2025, we're going to see further reductions, largely as a result of the state renewable portfolio standards, which are standards which require the privately owned utilities in the different states. Each state regulates those utilities itself in the U.S., and they are gradually pushing up their demand that the utilities generate a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources. That's going to push up that increase still more. Then we get the city actions, which are uncertain at this stage of the game, but the carbon pricing actions by the cities, these new initiatives that I've just described, are going to help overcome some of that gap, and we're well over halfway to fulfilling the objectives, even including those states that are not participating yet. And I think there will be additional pressure on them, partially because, and let's go on to the next slide while I'm talking, but partially because what we have in this situation is more pressure on those states and cities. If you're a company and you're picking your location as to where you wish to be, and you want to have good publicity both nationally and internationally, would you rather go someplace and say, we're intentionally going to this city because it is attempting to support the climate agreement, or we're going to this city despite the fact that it isn't doing anything? So that, in fact, the competition between cities is going to end up benefiting those that are supporting the climate agreement. I think that'll make a difference in the U.S. This comes back to the comment that I made earlier about the fact that the super-local political environment can influence local economic activity and local decisions and local support for green infrastructure. And we see that here. That was the national commitments on greenhouse gas reduction may change ideologies. Moving backwards can also change ideologies at the local level. We're seeing an increased interest in the most efficient ways of reducing emissions. New options are always being welcomed now because the cities are literally competing with each other to do this in the U.S. We're seeing subnational commitments growing where local financing capacity exists, which it does to some degree in the U.S. and Germany. You can also see it elsewhere in Europe. It's somewhat harder to see in parts of the world where there's very limited local financing capacity, whether it's the borrowing capacity of municipalities or their ability to raise their own funds. This is clearly a problem, but we are already seeing subnational commitments growing. I think that demonstration effect may be important. And once again, that local commitment's not fixed, it's malleable, and that's why the Paris Accord has made a difference. So let's move on to the next slide so we can get a sense of how this actually works. All right, we've talked already about climate infrastructure finance, and we talked about the ability to predict the risks of higher future costs of carbon, whether that's the carbon risk disclosure or that is finding more about the social cost and price of carbon, which is something that these cities in the U.S. are now, the states, excuse me, in the U.S. are now pursuing with Resources for the Future, a major environmental think tank. But all of this is really the carbon pricing is the underlying thing that underpins this. The carbon pricing permits us to get to the carbon risk disclosure. The carbon risk disclosure is critical to be able to say what the benefits are from investing in a climate resilient infrastructure. So basically the carbon pricing is essential to being able to finance climate resilient infrastructure. CP leads to CRD, which then leads to CIF, the climate infrastructure finance. And at this point, I will turn it back to Reimund to discuss what's going on with carbon pricing.
Yeah, as the time is already almost coming to a close, we can only have a glimpse of what's going on in the world of carbon pricing, or what is nowadays called effective carbon pricing. It's a new OECD concept that actually overcomes this very unproductive scholarly economics dispute between taxes, tradable permits. Just put a price on carbon, and we call that effective carbon pricing. And as you see, a lot is going on in the world of effective carbon pricing. The World Bank promotes that very much, but also at the national level we see efforts. Just this overview that the World Bank produced give us an idea. Well, you see, actually main blocks are still the European Emission Trading Scheme, called abbreviated EU ETS, and you see it's still, let's say, the base case of effective carbon pricing in the world. So about 5% of the global GHG is priced through the EU emission trading scheme. But you also see a new big block, a new big kid on the block, that is China with its national ETS. If that comes into play, and in fact it has already in an initial phase, it would cover about 10% in addition to the pricing in Europe. So it's roughly 2 times as large as the EU ETS. So these are the main bases, and there are a lot of others, and particularly there are cases from the US like RGGI, but also at the city level. Much of this very colorful middle of the pillar is essentially cities like Tokyo, Kyoto in Japan, Korea as a small country, but also Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Beijing from China that deliver towards the goal. Just running and roughly through this kind of landscape of effective carbon pricing. Sorry, oh, that goes to the end. It's EU ETS, as I say. Well, just a glimpse, and you all know it. It was for the long time the biggest and singular effective carbon pricing scheme in the world. But in difference to what most of the people would expect, it didn't deliver towards the goal, much of the goal. The prices were much too slow and much too volatile. As you see, most of the time it was below the 15 degrees. It's currently below 10 degrees, between below 15 euro, but now it's even below 10 euro. And that is largely due to the fact that there was a very powerful lobby in Europe that put resistance to a higher pricing scheme in Europe. It seems that at this long journey to which we had to learn that carbon pricing, at least at the level of reflecting the social cost of carbon, is a long way to go and starts at a very low level in terms of pricing. We finally learned to respond to the needs. At least the European Parliament a week ago, in fact, only decided on a kind of radical reform program, mainly in responding towards the need to decrease the EU cap from 2021 onwards to set a chunk of unused allowance aside, or surplus allowance, as it's said, aside in the market stability reserve, where excesses can be cancelled after a few years if they are not put into the circular flow of allowances needed, but only depress the price otherwise. And of course, member states can also initiate. Sorry, that is the wrong slide. Just not to interrupt, we see some major efforts taking in Europe towards coming back to a meaningful emission trading scheme. And we need to, because it's essentially the basis. I have to run through the slides again. And maybe I could just from here, without having the slides in front of us, but basically going to China, just look into what is the new kid on the block, so to speak, which will give most probably a much more important signal on pricing. No, the number is different now. Than the EU ETS had done in the past. Well, it's, as I say, it's still very much embryonic, though the ambitions of it are actually quite demanding. The goal is to achieve as a low carbon economy, so to speak, in 2030. The ETS is actually the single tool of the national government of China, embedded in various policies and cover almost a quarter of the total GHG emissions of China. So that's simply huge. As I say, it's double the size than Europe is in terms of the EU ETS. It started with a pilot phase of 7 cities and provinces, and it is to become a national ETS in the future. Currently, the national ETS is put into legislation, but it was, so to speak, reduced to the electricity sector, though it was planned much wider initially in the legislation. The cap is actually decided at the province level and or at the municipal level. There are some municipalities involved. So that's almost bottom up, as you see, not top down. And it's mostly based on historic emission, which is quite lenient but it is a way that ETS usually starts. Here's some latest news. Shenyang, actually not a very big city. I mean, every Chinese city is big, but it's not as big as Shanghai or Beijing. They also started a city level carbon market. So rather than being part of the province of Lianyong, they decided at a city level to separate. We have a fixed price. That's the next novelty from China. To avoid what we saw in Europe, the Chinese, so to say, pulled in a minimum price level. And as you see, the minimum price level, which was very low, I must say, was very effectively pulling the price to a certain level that the Chinese government wanted to achieve. So basically, you see it's larger and it's innovative, what is happening in China. But another example to go again towards the US, because which relies on a long-term experience, is RGGI, with something that we saw in the past, but also see currently. So Peter, could you give us the latest and the past of RGGI?
Okay, well, you see the basic statistics on RGGI right here. Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative involves basically the states in the northeastern United States. It is obviously much smaller than either the Chinese effort or the European ETS, but it actually has done rather well and probably has been quite successful. The last pricing I saw was a 14% increase over the prior year in the price of the carbon emission permissions. But what we see is that the member states cut their emissions in the period 2008 to 2015 by more than double the rest of the United States, leaving out California, which has its own emissions trading. At the same time, their economies outgrew the rest of the U.S. They've invested the money that they've generated. That 1.37 billion is basically the proceeds from selling the emissions permissions. They've invested that in greenhouse gas mitigation efforts, which is projected to produce roughly a 3-to-1 benefit there if you look at that 4.67 billion. And they're saving a significant amount of fossil fuels within a relatively small geographic area, although with a significant population in the United States. So, and this is continuing. It certainly is not being stopped in any manner, shape, or form by what may be happening in Washington. And I think that one of the things that's important to keep in mind with regard to this is that under certain conditions, it does show that under certain conditions, you don't need the national leadership. This can take off all by itself. And when this was formed in 2008, there was not much of an initiative coming out of Washington, D.C. then, and it's maintained itself for a decade since, continuing to have a significantly positive impact. Reimund, you're back on, I think.
Yeah. So, dear audience, so we are running so late in our talk. Just to continue and be brief, do you think that an international agreement could have an immediate effect of what is going on, let's say, in enterprises? Whatever the nations do, can there be an immediate effect? Yes, we have seen that now from cities, they are acting, but mainly we saw in China that was through a national program. But here we can see it happens actually without any filtering of the national instances. At the Carbon Disclosure Project just shows what cities are doing by themselves without being forced to the national entities, and what companies do without being forced through a regulation at the national level, just voluntarily. And you see actually the effect of the Paris Agreement immediately was that the number of disclosed environmental risks at the company level, at the state level, but also at the city level, significantly increased out of the Paris Agreement without any filtering, without any catalyzing at the through national entities. And you see it happens actually not in developed countries, but in developing countries. Let's look at it in a little more detail to understand what is how we can improve on that. So it is quite successful. We see actually some convergence and divergences, means that we see not really a move towards a singular price. I just need the graph here. So let's look at the energy industries. Here you see, for example, British Petrol or ExxonMobil are doing, in fact, much longer than this chart displays, a kind of a carbon pricing at the voluntary level. They are not forced to do so. That is almost fee-like. It's at a certain, it's in calculating their investment, they assume a price of carbon of 40 in the terms of British Petrol, of $80 per CO2 equivalent throughout the years. And they started to do that in 2009, and they continue to do that after passing the Paris Agreement. Whereas on, let's say, if I move over to the utility level, you see quite some divergent on prices, not a kind of traditional routine in voluntary carbon pricing. You have utilities that set a price of 1 US dollar per ton of CO2 equivalent, whereas others are calculating in their investment at a price of almost 300. So there's a large variance in utility accounting for the cost of carbon, and that's somehow leads us to think about how can we achieve towards the level, or can the level of carbon pricing that is oriented to the social cost of carbon. As we are now so much advanced in time, I will not go into the economics or the economic graphics here. That is too complicated and more for the classroom. The question is, the essence is prices exist, as we have seen. They exist without national interference, just through international decisions and triggering down to the level, to the subnational level of cities and companies. But these carbon prices are currently not standardized. Some companies, big companies like British Petrol or Exxon use a standardized methodology, but not actually even across their sector of energy. And it's getting much more diverse in the sector of utilities. So investors cannot really know what are the prices and what are the drivers of prices. As long as we don't have a standardized methodology of carbon price accounting. But let's say if we would achieve to have a standardized approach, and much is conducted at the level of the finance sector, that means Bloomberg and Carney, sitting over standardized procedures to account for the price of carbon, they still do at the level not reflecting the social cost of carbon. They don't consider the risk. They often consider just the marginal abatement cost for certain goals that companies or cities want to achieve, but not considering the damages out of emitting carbon. So what we need is essentially a carbon price target, and Lord Stern was very clear on the One Planet Summit in last November. We need a price target of at least $40 to $80 per ton of carbon CO2 equivalent. Actually, in short term, that means even in 2020, the voluntary elements help, but they don't suffice, so to speak, towards the goal of achieving the 2 degrees goal. So let's pull all the things together, so to speak. And one of our majors in pulling things together is, of course, Peter. So Peter, please, can you try to make out of this the fragments we had been giving the full picture of our seminar?
Well, this is going to be difficult because we have to do it very, very quickly, but let me try. All right, we have before us, you will notice in this particular slide that instead of looking at carbon pricing, going to carbon risk disclosure, going to carbon infrastructure financing, we have something called blended value, BV. And the blended value is where we bring in that question of the social cost of carbon, because we need to deal with what we may best call co-benefits. We will come back to that in just a second. But we have the bankability on the one hand, we have the accessibility, in other words, is there money there? Do we have the capacity to service the debt? Versus the question of bankability, which is, are we trusted to service the debt? And then we have this question of local political will, which is really critical to this bankability question. And everything depends in terms of the local political will, among other things, on the local co-benefits. That is to say, what are the benefits of engaging in this activity to try and produce more climate resilient infrastructure, what are the co-benefits of engaging in this activity? So let's move on to the next slide quickly.
Yes, I
And we found that in 2014, I have to admit this was a study that I ended up producing, but the U.S. Department of Energy found that investing in local energy infrastructure provided a whole array of different kinds of local economic benefits. Jobs, energy cost savings, it costs less. If you have more distributed energy, the energy supply is greater. There is more certainty. One of the big things that happened in the U.S. in the case of New Jersey, for example, as the result of Superstorm Sandy, was that the energy supply was knocked out almost for the entire state. The state has ended up spending significant amounts of money simply trying to assure energy price certainty. Improved business competitiveness comes from energy cost savings, energy supply certainty. All of those things are valuable to local businesses. They become more competitive. And certainly in the U.S. context, where property values and tax revenues raised at the local level come from, among other things, that business competitiveness, that business activity, that's another kind of a co-benefit. But perhaps the biggest one, and I referred to it earlier, is the city marketing and reputation. All sorts of cities compete for inward investment. And certainly where you are competing for inward investment, you do get benefits from what you do to do more energy efficient investments. And in this particular case, I could cite a small city of about 20,000 in the state of Iowa that lost its major employer, couldn't figure out what to do, and ended up discovering that its manufacturing capacity and its workers had the capacity to build the veins for wind power, for the windmills to produce power, and they discovered that they had the capacity to produce the veins, and they advertised the fact that they were producing these veins, which are very large, difficult to transport, and there's a great deal of wind power in Iowa, so it was logical to be someplace where you didn't have to transport these large things after being manufactured. The net result of this is this small town got a reputation. Next thing that it got was they got a European company coming in to build the actual towers that the veins turn on. And they've been able to compound their development by virtue of building on the reputation for doing something that constituted an investment in renewable energy. And I think that that's an example of the kinds of co-benefits that can exist. If we go on to the next slide, we've got some other kinds of examples. The table here, the little illustration, is a calculation that was done again from RGGI, but it's the cumulative health benefits from RGGI between 2009 to 2014. Totally different kind of co-benefits. And what we have here is, I'm pretty sure that it's readable, but we're talking about deaths. We're talking about reduced heart attacks, bronchitis, asthma, other kinds of respiratory problems. And when you get down to the economics again, you've got a significant reduction in the number of lost work days and days of restricted activity for miners. This is very, very significant kinds of additional co-benefits. These are the things that are going to end up driving action at the local level, it seems to me, and they need to be studied and examined in order to be able to generate the will to produce these kinds of benefits. If you look at the numbers here, sort of the central projection of just these health benefits was $5.7 billion, which is more than the returns that I showed earlier with regard to what the benefits were from $1.4 billion invested in further energy efficiency and renewable energy efforts. So we can move on to the last slide and conclude with the lessons. Take-home message. Access to capital. I don't need to read these to you. You can read them as well as I can. But I think that the really critical element is what we've been talking about the need for infrastructure and the concern with climate change and the concern with the benefits associated with doing something about it is going to be critical at the urban level for the success of the Paris Accords. And I think that we should really turn as quickly as we can to see if we've got some questions now. So
Yes,
our last
thanks.
slide, if we go to it before we hit the questions, the last slide tells you how to get in touch with Reimund and myself. You've got emails for us here, and I'm sure I would love to hear from you, and I'm sure that Reimund would as well.
Yes, thanks a lot, Peter. Thanks to you and thanks to Reimund for a very insightful presentation, as Stelios tells you in the chat box. And I can just agree with that. And I'm very glad that you mastered the technical hurdles that have we seen, and in particular heard or not heard in this in our conversation. So we have indeed a few questions and about 5 minutes in the scheduled time. So I would like to ask you both gentlemen for very short answers. And I'd like to start with the question by Stelios. He asks, the carbon tax, what is your view about it, and what other kind of tax-related schemes for cities could be applied? Reimund, is that something that you would like to take as a question?
Essentially, the carbon price target of the One Planet Summit is in essence a tax and not a price driven by market mechanisms. And so in that sense, the tax is going to be the future. And now looking at the city level, because we are about cities finance, well, of course, we have very few taxes at the city level in many regions of the world, but we have fees on which we can do. And as I explained initially in the seminar, where we have land taxes, importantly in the US and Latin America, we can draw on tax increment financing to finance green infrastructure. Good examples are given, in fact, by Stelios yourself. As you know, your work at in the Netherlands and on Latin America gives some evidence to the effectiveness of tax increment finance.
Thanks for that clarification. Peter, is there something that you would like to add?
Well, I think that it depends. A great deal of this depends on the nature of the competition, which sometimes exists, which frequently exists between localities, at least in the U.S. context, for businesses to come into the area. If in fact you levy a local tax and the city, 50 kilometers away doesn't levy a tax, your city is going to be at a bit of a disadvantage. So I think the carbon tax is more a question for regional or national policy than it is for municipal policy. And I'd make that distinction. That said, there is certainly the opportunity for trying to demonstrate that there are benefits to delivering resilient infrastructure, both to businesses, as I suggested, as well as to the municipalities. And in fact, that may be a basis for something else which could be an alternative to a tax, which is some sort of public-private partnership. I'm just noticing that we just got another question in, which I would love to try and answer.
Yeah.
On carbon pricing. Can I get to that briefly?
Take it briefly indeed, and then Peter, please.
Yeah, very quickly. I think that the best example I could give you in the U.S. context clearly is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the U.S. on the one hand, and the carbon pricing that takes place in California on the other. They are successful, they are reducing emissions, and they're certainly not damaging economic growth.
So thanks for sharing that success story. And I suggest we take the other a bit longer question coming from Nigeria, from a developing country context, from Olajumoke. Excuse me if that was not pronounced correctly, but your question is indeed very interesting, and I suggest to give it to Reimund. What do you think are the practical steps that developing countries like Nigeria are supposed to take?
Yeah, thank you, Jami, for the question, because there seems to be a little concern that Nigeria wouldn't have progressed on that. But if you look at to the UNEP or World Bank publication, Nigeria is actually often given as a best practice case of climate resilience finance. But let's say, what are the practical steps taken and needed in many of the developing countries? One is, of course, to have a national plan for green finance. China did that years ago. In essence, Nigeria also did in 2014, at least a national plan for green banks. And I think banks are at the heart of finance. And also reaching out to low carbon finance scheme of development banks like the African Development Bank, and Nigeria did reach out to an investment plan under the CTF finance of the African Development Bank, which would give $250 million to modernize transport in Lagos and other cities of Nigeria, and leverage another $1 billion in private investment on top of the 250 million. So essentially, the major efforts that are needed are having a clear national plan for greening the finance sector, and supporting that with reach out to development banks in the region, like African development banks. Your question that you added was what additional policies are needed to those that had already been taken. In Nigeria, as I said, is often brought as a best practice case. So essentially, would be to go beyond the banks rather than greening just the banks, so to speak, go to the larger finance sector, funds, inclusive insurance, or other further innovations in that field. And of course, with your concern, I really stumble whether we need more than have just a national plan, but having also plans implemented in Nigeria. And that seems to be there seems to be a trigger down problem from just having national plans and getting it done on the ground. So probably another improvement needed is not economic incentive, but some progress measurement at the achievements that are completed under the national plans. I hope that answers your questions, Jami, in some form.
Thanks a lot, Reimund. I have a few additional questions by email, and I would say I'll pick maybe two of them, one for each of you. And if there are any further from the audience also still with us, please put them to the chat box. And I see, Jami, you are writing. Yeah, you're welcome. And from the mails, from other mails I received, maybe it fits nicely just from our European perspective, and maybe a bit prejudiced perspective, if I continue with that one, related to the creditworthiness of cities and the role of corruption in there. There was a specific question asking, if a city is not creditworthy, how can better risk disclosure alone and bankability attract new capital when the prospective borrower suffers from corruption or mismanagement? Peter, is that something that I can ask you to respond to, please?
Well, you can ask me to respond to it. Whether I respond adequately is another question. Sorry, I could not resist. I think look, when a city is not creditworthy by virtue of the corruption in the city, and the question as to if, in fact, you provide finance to the city where the funds are ever going to be used for the purpose for which the application was declared, you've got a very serious problem. I mean, you know, you're not going to get a bank, you're not going to get insurance companies, or in certainly the Western context where you've got large pension funds, you're not going to get superannuation pools being willing to lend money under those circumstances. But I think that part of the way around that may be that certain infrastructure projects may be created and managed by some entity other than the city itself. Whether this represents a public-private partnership that is different from the city, or a separate, certainly what you could do in the U.S., and I think to some degree, depending on where you are in Europe as well, where you have separate kinds of legal entities that are at some arm's length from the city itself and the local government, it may be able to manage this. The problem in the context of corruption is the question of whether or not the funds ever go to the purpose to which they are intended. And that's an extremely to get around. You know, that leaves out the question as to whether or not the project would be successful if it got the funds. That's at that stage of the game, that's become a second question, not even the primary. So I think it's a very, very difficult thing to overcome.
Thanks a lot, Peter, for that, I think, very good attempt to answer to that difficult question. And let me put the last question that I received in the previous day from the announcement list to Reimund. The question is related to, again, a foreign country perspective. Certainly, city-level emissions trading might make sense, the writer says, but how can one go about launching one trading system when the municipality is not as big as China or the Shenzhen region? You had that Chinese example in your talk.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I agree, a very small city will have a problem, but essentially it's not a matter of the size of the city in terms of population, but rather in size, the size of the emissions of the city. Let's say the city of Tokyo, roughly 21 million people living there, is only covering 18% of its total emission. In essence, in terms of emissions, it's just 1/5 of what it is in terms of population. But that is essentially the matter. How can you achieve a large enough market in terms of emissions? It need not be a mega city like Tokyo. Part of Tokyo, so to speak, serves the needs of an emission trading scheme. Saitama, which is essentially another city in Japan that took over as a city emission trading scheme, is just 7 million, also not fully covering the whole set of emissions in the city. So you have examples with relatively, and it has 7 million population only, so you have relatively moderately big, not necessarily mega cities that could deal and sustainably deal with emission trading schemes. In Tokyo, it's actually this phase 2. And also, it depends on it's sizing up the emissions. And if you're a very small city, you may, let's say, consider, just an idea I have at the spot, to join forces, so to speak, with larger emitters, let's say neighboring airports, that is not essentially a part of the city, but maybe of another infrastructure in the region. So sizing up emissions is the key, not the size of the population. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Reimund. And with that encouraging words that we are not depending on the city size alone to implement successful regimes, I'd like to thank the audience from wherever you are, from wherever you joined us. Please, it is, I think, up to all of us to do our bits and pieces to further provide support to implementing and letting happen that schemes. I would once more invite you to join the DE-Usenet network. If you want to get in touch with Reimund or Peter, you will find them at the network. So if you haven't already, please join us in that forum to exchange with Reimund, Peter, and other professionals, in particular from Germany and the US, about their experiences, but with stories and also potential implications and inspiration also from everywhere you're joining. So we are looking to stay in touch with you, and we say goodbye for today, and doing that with a small movie, if it still runs, on saying this is our DUSNet network. Thank you for joining today. Enjoy the evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Goodbye, and once again, thank you for putting up with me.